I sat very still while the hands went up, one after another, like a slow and terrible tide. My mother-in-law had just asked the entire family to decide whether I still belonged among them, and the room was answering her without a single flicker of shame. 13 hands. I counted them the way I count everything that matters, quietly, completely, without letting my face move so much as an inch. I didn't shout. I didn't cry. I didn't beg a single one of them to lower a hand. I only looked at the long candlelit table, at the light catching in the cut crystal, at the faces of people I had quietly fed and rescued and shielded for years, and I let them believe they had finally won. Before I tell you how I took back everything they were standing on in 8 short days, without ever raising my voice, let me ask you one thing, my friend. Wherever you're listening from tonight, drop it in the comments, because I want to know who's riding with me. And if you've ever sat at a table full of relatives who smiled in your face while sharpening a knife behind your back, tap that like and stay close, because I'm about to show you exactly what calm can do once it decides to move. I'm Margot, 30 years old, and I build brands for people who can't afford to lose. I spend my days protecting trademarks, untangling licensing deals gone sideways, and quietly steering luxury labels through the kind of crisis that ends companies. My whole career is built on one discipline: stay calm while everything around you burns, and never let your face tell anyone what your hands are already doing. But nothing I'd survived in a boardroom prepared me for what waited under the chandeliers of the Whitlock estate, in the soft green hills just outside Bardstown, Kentucky, the self-proclaimed bourbon capital of the world, and the kingdom my late husband's family had ruled for 4 generations. It was Founder's Day, the night the Whitlocks gathered every year to toast themselves and the brand they'd built, Whitlock Reserve, the small batch bourbon that sat on the shelves of every fine restaurant from Louisville to Lexington. The estate smelled like wood smoke and oak, and the faint sweetness of mash drifting up from the rickhouses. It had been 2 years, almost to the day, since my husband Elliot drowned when his boat went over on the lake during a sudden storm. This was the first Founder's Day I'd agreed to attend since his funeral, and I'd only come for one reason: so our daughter could sit where her father once sat, and feel, for one evening, like she still had his people. But the moment I settled into my chair at that long walnut table, I understood I had walked straight into something rehearsed. The Whitlocks were Kentucky royalty, and Eleanor Whitlock was their crown. My mother-in-law had spent decades building 2 reputations at once: Queen of the Bourbon Heritage Society and a tireless, generous saint of the First Methodist congregation downtown. To the wider world, she was warmth itself: ribbon cuttings, charity galas, a soft hand on every shoulder. Behind the iron gates, she ruled through money and shame, and she had decided from the day Elliot brought me home that I would never truly belong. I hadn't come up in their circles. I wore my own clothes instead of the heirloom pearls she expected, and I'd built my own firm instead of bending my life around the distillery. Elliot had been her golden boy, the heir, and she never forgave him for choosing a woman who refused to kneel. Dinner had been tense from the first pour. I sat near the middle of the table, cutting my food quietly, listening to the brittle small talk while Eleanor held court at the head in a deep plum gown, the candlelight bouncing off the diamonds at her throat. She spent the better part of an hour bragging record sales, a new cask program, a fresh wing she'd funded at the church. I happened to know the real numbers behind Whitlock Reserve were a slow-moving disaster, but I kept my eyes on my plate and said nothing. Then, just as the plates were being cleared, the temperature in the room changed. Eleanor lifted her glass and tapped it twice with a silver spoon. The clear little chime cut straight through the chatter, and the table fell silent. She rose slowly, smoothing the front of her gown, and her eyes settled on me like a verdict already written. Family. She began in that rolling, practiced cadence she used from the front pew. Founder's Day is a night for gratitude, a night to honor the blood and the bourbon that made us who we are. But it is also a night to protect what we've built. She let the pause stretch until every eye in the room had found her. Since the Lord called my beloved Elliot home, the spirit of this table has soured. We have tried, Lord knows we have tried to fold his widow into our family. We've offered her our prayers and our patience, but Margot has only grown colder and prouder. She skips our gatherings. She turns her back on our church. And her contempt for everything we hold sacred is poisoning the joy out of this house. I kept my expression smooth and empty, a still pond she could throw stones at all night without making a ripple. The nerve of it was almost beautiful. I'd skipped her dinners because they curdled into cross-examinations about my finances and my parenting. I'd skipped her galas because she only ever used them as a stage, but I gave her nothing. It's plain to me, and to many of you who've come to me privately, Eleanor continued, lifting her chin, that Margot no longer wishes to carry the Whitlock name. She behaves as though she stands above the very family that opened its arms to her. We cannot let that bitterness rot what 4 generations built. So tonight, for the peace and dignity of this family, I am calling a vote. I move that Margot be permanently removed from all Whitlock gatherings, holidays, and family affairs from this night forward. The words hung in the smoke-sweet air. It was an execution, performed in front of an audience with linen napkins. I didn't gasp. I didn't defend myself. I simply waited to see who, in all that crowd of people I had quietly carried, would be brave enough to speak. Instead, the hands began to climb. Eleanor's first, raised high and proud. Then my sister-in-law, Cora Elliott's younger sister, her glossed lips curling into a satisfied little smile. This was a woman whose repossessed SUV I had personally paid off 8 months earlier, in secret, to spare her the humiliation in front of these very people. Beside her, aunts and uncles and cousins lifted their hands one by one, the same relatives I had hosted in my own home, the same ones who'd hugged me at the door barely 2 hours before. 13 hands rose over that table. 13 people voting to erase me, while a grandfather clock ticked in the hall and no one dared to breathe. They were all watching me, waiting for the break, waiting for the screaming, the tears, the ugly reaction that would prove Eleanor right. But I sat there absorbing it, calm as still water, my mind already 3 moves ahead. It was Trent who broke the silence, Cora's husband, a soft-handed man who'd attached himself to the Whitlock orbit 5 years back and never let go. Trent had reinvented himself a dozen times, life coach, crypto consultant, and now, by his own decree, the distillery's chief brand officer. He wore a linen blazer and a sorrowful look of a man about to do something cruel and call it growth. "Margot," he said gently, folding his hands as if he were leading a meditation rather than a stoning. "We need you to really hear us. Losing Elliot fractured this whole family. We've been doing the work to heal, together, as a unit, but your energy lately? It's been heavy. You isolated. You poured yourself into that little consulting firm instead of leaning on us, and that kind of self-sufficiency, it reads as rejection. We're trying to build something generational here, and you keep standing outside the circle making everyone feel small." I didn't blink. I simply added his words to a ledger he didn't know existed. Trent had not held steady work in 3 years. He lived in a guest house Eleanor owned and survived on schemes, and here he was lecturing me about building wealth while drinking bourbon I had quietly kept from going under. Cora jumped in, her bangles clattering against the table. "Exactly. You walk around like running your fancy firm makes you better than the family that made Elliot who he was. You're a widow, Margot. You're supposed to need us. Instead, you act untouchable. But don't forget you only ever sat at this table because my brother loved you. Without him, you're just a guest who forgot to leave." I looked at her, this woman who lived for an audience she'd never met, whose cards declined at the grocery store, whose luxury life I had personally kept off the auction block, and I felt something cold and clean settle into place inside me. I said nothing. I scanned the rest of the table, the aunts and uncles studying their plates, too comfortable in Eleanor's good graces to risk a word, and I understood that they had all traded their loyalty for the warmth of a fire they didn't realize was already going out. I was fully prepared to let them finish, gather my coat, and walk out in silence. I'd faced rooms far more dangerous than this one. But then a small, trembling hand tugged at the cuff of my jacket. I turned and looked down at my daughter. June was 7, with her father's serious dark eyes and his exact way of going quiet when the world frightened her. She'd been sitting beside me the whole time, eating her dinner like a good girl. Now her fork lay forgotten, and fat tears were rolling down her cheeks onto the collar of her dress. She didn't understand the money or the jealousy that drove her grandmother, but she understood perfectly what it meant when a room full of grown-ups raised their hands against her mother. "Mommy," June whispered, her voice cracking. "Why don't they want us anymore?" Something in my chest went to pieces and then reassembled into something far harder than before. I pulled her against my side, wrapped both arms around her shaking shoulders, and pressed my lips to her hair. "They're confused, sweet pea," I murmured. "That's all. You and me are exactly where we're supposed to be." The sound of a child crying should have shamed at least one adult at that table into decency. Instead, Eleanor sighed, as though my daughter's tears were simply more proof of how dramatic I made everything. And just like that, the last thread holding me to any mercy for these people quietly snapped. I lifted June onto my hip, gathered my purse, and walked out without a backward glance. I drove the dark highway back to Louisville with the radio off, the hum of the road filling the car, while June slept against the window. By the time I'd carried her up to bed and pulled the quilt to her chin, I already knew exactly how this would end. The next morning, I went silent. No calls, no messages, no posts. I knew my quiet would drive Eleanor out of her mind, because women like my mother-in-law feed on conflict. Every fight is a stage where she gets to play either the martyr or the matriarch. By refusing to step onto that stage, I starved her. By Wednesday, Cora and Trent had taken their grievance public, posting tearful little videos to their followers about the cold, greedy widow who'd abandoned a grieving family. And on Thursday, I learned that Eleanor had quietly stripped my name from the Elliott Whitlock Memorial Apprenticeship, the cooperage program I had built and funded in my husband's name, to train young people in the dying art of barrel making. She'd erased him from his own legacy to spite me. That was the moment I stopped feeling anything but resolve. Their first mistake came dressed as a victory. Friday morning, a curt message arrived from Eleanor's assistant. The family was reclaiming company property, effective immediately. At the top of the list sat the 1,962 Ford pickup, the cherry red beauty painted on every bottle of Whitlock Reserve, the rolling symbol of the whole brand. It was titled to the distillery for tax reasons. What Eleanor didn't know, what no one knew, was that the gleaming truck in all their photographs wasn't the original at all. The real one had rusted to a ruin years ago when the family couldn't afford its restoration. I had quietly bought it, paid for a full frame-up rebuild out of my own pocket, and loaned it back to them so their precious icon could keep rolling. So I gave Eleanor exactly what she asked for. I called Cyrus, a restoration genius in the South End who owed me a favor after I saved his shop from a brutal lawsuit. That afternoon, his crew loaded the rusted, gutted original onto a flatbed, the real company property, the wreck they'd written off long ago, and delivered it to the distillery gates during the busiest tour hour of the day. They set it down in full view of 40 visiting tourists, tied a ridiculous oversized red bow to its corroded hood, and left a single cream envelope under the wiper. The restored truck, the one I owned outright, I drove home myself. The note read only, "Company property returned, exactly as the company left it." By noon, my phone was lighting up Cora, then Trent, then 3 calls from Eleanor herself, watching 100 phones photograph a rusted hulk in front of their flagship. I let every one of them ring out, sipped my coffee, and got ready for the part that actually mattered. The truck was the appetizer. My lawyer was the main course. At 10 o'clock, I walked into the glass conference room of Hartley and Renee, the most feared corporate firm in the state, and sat down across from Renee herself, a woman who simply did not lose, in a sharp charcoal suit, with a folder already waiting for me. "Saw the truck," she said, the corner of her mouth twitching. Theatrical. "But we've got far bigger barrels to crack today. Ready to look at the real numbers?" Inside the folder lay the licensing and lending agreements for Whitlock Reserve, and the secret I'd kept for 3 years. Long before Elliot died, the family business had been quietly drowning. Eleanor had bled the accounts dry on galas and appearances, ignored the market, and let the debt swallow them. Their old lender was preparing to seize everything, including the trademark itself, the name on every bottle. Elliot had come to me in tears, begging me to save his father's life's work. I had the capital, But I knew Eleanor's pride would never let her accept a rescue from the daughter-in-law she despised. She'd burn the whole distillery down before admitting I had more power than her bloodline. So, I built a quiet holding company called Cardinal Brands. Cardinal swept in, bought the Whitlock Reserve trademark out from under the creditors, and absorbed the note on the distillery and its distribution deal. For 3 years, Eleanor had bragged to her friends about the brilliant arrangement she'd struck with a faceless, out-of-state investor. The investor was me, sitting at my kitchen table, quietly keeping her empire alive. Trent signed the renewal yesterday, Renee said, tapping the page with one finger, eyes bright with satisfaction. Played executive. Didn't have a single lawyer read it. He thought it was a formality, so he rushed it through to look decisive for Eleanor. He had blindly signed a 10-year brand licensing renewal and inside it, an accelerated default clause. Under the original terms, Whitlock & Sons was obligated to complete $250,000 in compliance and quality upgrades to the rickhouses by the end of the fiscal year. They hadn't done $1 of it. They hadn't even pulled the permits. Worse, Renee slid a forensic summary across the table. Trent, in his role as self-appointed brand officer, had siphoned nearly $200,000 out of the operating accounts and into a fake marketing agency money that had actually gone to crypto gambling and an apartment for a woman who was not his wife. The moment Cardinal issues the default notice, Renee said, closing the folder with a snap, they have 7 days to pay the full amount. If they can't, Cardinal revokes their license to the Whitlock Reserve name and calls the note. They'll be sitting on a distillery full of bourbon they cannot legally sell under any name a single soul recognizes, on land they can't pay for. I looked out at the skyline. They had voted to erase me, never once imagining I owned the name they hid behind. Send it, I said, by courier, to the distillery, by hand. The call came 48 hours later. I was in my sunroom when my phone lit up with the contact photo I'd assigned Eleanor years ago, her at the pulpit in an enormous feathered hat. I put it on speaker and leaned back. Margot, sweetheart. The voice was syrup now, all maternal warmth, not a trace of the woman who'd sighed at my crying child. I've been praying so hard for you and little June. The house feels empty without you. I know feelings ran high on Founders' Day, but you know how passionate this family is. Grief makes us all say things. At the end of the day, family is family. Good morning, Eleanor, I said, flat as river ice. What can I do for you? She took a long, shaky breath, swallowing what was left of her pride. Well, the business has hit a bit of a snag. There's this dreadful out-of-state outfit, Cardinal Brands, that holds the rights to our name, and they've sent the most outrageous, predatory demand. $250,000 over some old paperwork. It's practically extortion. I need you, Margot. You handle bullies like this every day. I need you to find out who runs Cardinal, get them on the phone, and make this disappear. I admired the fresh polish drying on my nails. That sounds stressful, Eleanor. But why bring it to me? Didn't you just appoint Trent your chief brand officer? Surely a man of his vision can navigate a simple licensing dispute. The silence on the line told me everything. She couldn't lean on Trent because Trent was already exposed in her own house, a thief, a liar, the most hated man at her table. Because family helps family, Eleanor snapped, the warmth cracking. Because this is Elliot's legacy. You're his widow. You have an obligation to protect the empire your husband loved. You can't sit in your downtown penthouse and watch his family be devoured. She was reaching for my dead husband again, the way she always did a leash she'd used for years to keep me writing silent checks. Let me make sure I have this right, I said softly. 1 week ago, you held a vote to ban me from this family forever. You called me toxic in front of 13 witnesses. Cora went online and called me a wicked, greedy widow. You scrubbed my name off the apprenticeship I built in Elliot's memory. And now, 7 days later, you're calling to demand I use my career to save your business in the name of family loyalty. Have I got that right? You're dwelling on the past, she pleaded, panic bleeding through. I'm talking about June's future. If Whitlock falls, your daughter loses her birthright. Do this for her. Here's the thing, Eleanor. I let my voice drop. You let Trent sign a 10-year licensing deal. with an accelerated default, without a single lawyer reading the fine print. And he rewarded that trust by stealing $200,000 to spend on crypto chips and a girlfriend across town. A sharp breath. How could you possibly know that? Because I know everything. I know your credit is maxed. I know your suppliers are about to freeze your accounts. I know you don't have the money to pay Cardinal. Then you know we'll lose it all, she cried, the matriarch finally collapsing into the victim. Margot, please, you have the leverage. Call Cardinal's board. Ask them for mercy. Ask them for an extension. I looked at the late sun pooling on the floor. I can't do that, Eleanor. Why not? She shrieked. Because I can't ask them for a favor, I said quietly, when I can't ask myself for one. There is no board. There never was a faceless investor. 3 years ago, when your empire was 6 months from being seized, Elliot came to me on his knees, because he knew you'd rather go bankrupt than take help from me. So I took my own money, and I built Cardinal Brands, and I bought the name out from under your creditors. I am Cardinal Brands, Eleanor. I own the name on every bottle you sell. I own the note on your land. I own the parking lot where that rusted truck is sitting right now. The silence that followed was the most beautiful sound of my life, the held breath quiet that comes right after a roof gives way, before the dust even settles. They came to my office 2 days later, all 3 of them, because there was nowhere left to go. Trent walked in first and folded the moment Renee slid the forensic report across the desk. He dropped into a chair and put his head between his knees, already counting the years a federal sentence would cost him. Cora sank to the carpet, weeping, rocking, mourning the comfortable life vanishing beneath her. And Eleanor, the woman who'd commanded every room she ever entered, took 2 unsteady steps toward my desk, and her legs simply gave out. She went down onto the carpet, gripped the edge of my desk and begged, "Margot, I'm begging you." She choked. "Send Trent to prison. I don't care. He earned it. But have mercy on the name. On me." Marcus built this brand. Elliot built this brand with his own hands. If you shut those doors, you destroy the last thing he left in this world. Think of June. She's a Whitlock. How will you look your own daughter in the eye and tell her you burned down her father's legacy just to punish me? I came around the desk slowly and looked down at her. The gall it took to weaponize my dead husband and my crying child to save her own skin nearly stole my breath. This was the woman who'd sighed at June's tears 1 week ago. "Don't ever put my daughter's name in your mouth again," I said, and my voice was a quiet blade. She flinched. "You want to talk about Elliot's legacy? You didn't protect it. You hollowed it out. You let a con man drain the accounts so you could play matriarch at the country club. You let the rickhouses rot. You stiffed the farmers and the coopers who made the whiskey worth drinking. You didn't honor what he built, Eleanor. You infected it. And if I leave it in your hands one more day, there'll be nothing left for my daughter but debt and scandal." I crouched to her eye level. "I'm not destroying his legacy. I'm rescuing it from you." She went still. "I'm seizing all 3 properties," I told her, methodically. "I'm changing the locks at midnight. I'm liquidating every tainted account, paying every honest farmer and barrel maker you cheated, and rebuilding this brand from the wood up. And every appreciating asset, the name, the land, the recipes, goes into an irrevocable trust." I watched the color drain from her face. The sole beneficiary is June. She inherits a clean, profitable empire the day she turns 25. And until then, you, Cora, Trent, and every single one of the 13 hands that went up at that table will have 0 access to 1 cent of it. You're all cut off, permanently. You traded your seats for an evening of cruelty, and that's a debt none of you can pay back. "Where will I go?" she whispered. I mortgaged everything to keep up appearances. "I'd learn to budget," I said, and walked to the door, opening it to the security team already waiting. "Your seat at this table is closed. Get out of my office." The doors sealed behind them with a soft, final click, and the fall came swift and total. 2 days later, I watched the local news from my kitchen as Trent was marched out of a midtown apartment in handcuffs, charged with wire fraud and tax evasion, his face slack with the realization that there was no family money left to post his bail. Cora filed for divorce the next morning, a frantic attempt to outrun the wreckage. But without my hidden checks propping her up, the whole illusion collapsed. The SUV vanished. The cards were canceled. Her 50,000 followers evaporated the instant the money did. A few weeks later, my assistant confirmed she'd taken a closing shift at a roadside diner on the edge of town, wiping down sticky tables in a polyester uniform that smelled of old grease, her acrylic nails chipped to nothing. But the cruelest justice belonged to Eleanor. The bank moved fast on the mortgaged estate, and I drove past once to see the yellow foreclosure sign planted among her prize roses. She moved into a cramped one-bedroom in a tired building where the heat never quite worked. Yet the real punishment wasn't the poverty, it was the silence. The following Sunday, she walked into First Methodist, clinging to her last hope of playing the victim, but word of the fraud and the eviction had already raced through the congregation. When she walked down the center aisle, the very people she'd spent 30 years judging simply turned away. The pastor looked at his notes. The pew where she'd reigned for 2 decades stayed empty around her. She sat alone in the cold weight of their judgment, exiled from the only world that had ever mattered to her. And me? I rebuilt. Cardinal Brands took the 3 properties clean, tore down the tarnished old signs, paid back every honest farmer and cooper Eleanor had cheated, and sealed every barrel and every acre into a trust that bore one indisputable name. 6 months later, the air felt different, lighter, clean, entirely my own. I sat in a quiet meadow at the edge of a property I'd bought for the 2 of us, the long grass gold in the evening light, while June ran ahead chasing fireflies with no fear left anywhere in her small body. No grandmother waiting to sigh at her. No table where her place could be voted away. She was safe, and she was loved, and her future was locked behind doors no greedy hand would ever pry open. She looked back at me, laughing, her father's eyes shining, and I lifted my glass of his own bourbon to the fading light and let myself smile, really smile, for the first time in 2 years. They voted to push me out of the family, so I bought the name they were hiding behind, and I closed the door myself. Respect was never something I was going to beg them for. It's like good bourbon, my friend. You don't ask for it. You age it in the dark, you wait. And when the time is right, you decide exactly who gets a pour, and I own the bottle now. Notice who keeps showing up when the money is gone. That's your real family, blood or not. Margot's quiet strength didn't come from revenge. It came from one little girl worth protecting and a husband worth honoring. Guard the people who'd love you with empty pockets. Pay forward the kindness no one sees, and trust that patience, used gently, outlasts every loud and cruel voice in the room.